Hey guys, wanted to go over a quick CNBC interview with Jeff Gundlach, one of my favorites. I think he kind of understands the Austrian side of the argument very often. Schiff has always accused him of being his number one fan, listening to his podcast and kind of regurgitating the info that Peter goes over. I don't know if he's doing that or not. Who knows? But I do know why that's a compliment to Peter. And it also shows that I think Gundlach has his head on straight for sure. Especially compared to a lot of these people in the mainstream. With all the people in the mainstream, Gundlach is probably my favorite. Maybe Druckenmiller is up there. Jim Grant is probably my favorite in the main. That would be in that mainstream group. But anyway, I wanted to go over, his prediction long term is the dollar is doomed. He uses those exact words, but he specifies that this is over the long term. Over the short term, who knows, the dollar could even go up on the DXY. But I also wanted to go over his rationale for why the dollar is quote unquote doomed over the long term. So let's do a screen share and see if I can pull this off. So let's listen to what Gundlach is saying, and then we'll go into his rationale.
A higher dollar for the last few months. When it was below at about 89, we announced very publicly that we were positive on the dollar for the near term. It's a question of what your horizon is. In the near term, the dollar seems firm, and the reasons that you just articulated support that idea. In the longer term, I think the dollar. I don't want to be overly dramatic, but I think I will use the word doomed in the long term. I think in the short term, the dynamics have been and will continue to be in place for the dollar to be marginally or moderately stronger. What's interesting about that is as the dollar has firmed, commodity prices have been a little bit volatile, but they're very, very close to their highs on the Bloomberg.
So he doesn't really expand on it, but he kind of alluded to it at the beginning of the interview. And I think his main rationale for his calling the dollar doomed long term is what we call the twin deficits. So, and this is something that, interestingly enough, used to be really, really popular as far as the mainstream conversation on CNBC or Bloomberg, whatever. It's the twin deficits. This really used to move markets, and back in the 80s and the 90s, and I would assume even maybe in the early 2000s. And so what are the twin deficits? So we've got the budget deficit from the United States government. So if the government receives, let's say, $3 trillion in taxes, but yet they spend $5 trillion, then there is a deficit. So a budget deficit where they would have to issue $2 trillion worth of bonds to actually make those payments. So that would be one deficit, the government budget deficit. And if that is being monetized by the Fed, so meaning the Fed is buying the majority of the debt the government is issuing, then you have this situation where it could increase M2 money supply. And I want to be very careful the way I say this. It could increase M2 money supply as measured by the Fed. Because when you start to understand the commercial banking system a little bit better, you see that there are a lot of dollars that are going back and forth between banks in the form of, I hate to even use the word dollars because it's really just an electronic ledger system. But let's just say that there's a lot of dollars, quote unquote, cash on the balance sheets of these big banks, and maybe sometimes it's even off balance sheet. I don't want to. That's a completely separate topic for a separate video. But so you could have this situation, in my opinion, where the amount of dollars in aggregate total, when you combine all the dollars that are outside of the United States that are on the balance sheets of the commercial banking system and that are on the balance sheets of the individuals and entities in the real economy, non-bank entities. Let me be very clear, non-bank entities. I do think that you can have a situation where the amount of dollars in aggregate total shadows in what are just right here in front of our face actually decreases, while at the same time you can have consumer price inflation. Because as long as the dollars that are on the balance sheet of the entities, the non-bank entities, individuals in the real economy, as long as those dollars are going up at the rate of, call it 25% per annum, and we are seeing a decrease in the amount of goods and services being produced, we got to remember, we always got to look at the supply side of the equation as well. I think that you could have that environment. It's not always. Well, I shouldn't say it, because I was going to use Friedman's quote that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, and I think it is. But at the same token, I don't know that it's in aggregate, right? We can see the monetary the amount of dollars increase in just a portion of the bank accounts, and those are the bank accounts that matter, because the individuals who hold those bank accounts are chasing goods and services, where the total dollars that are on the balance sheets of the commercial banking system, as an example, I don't know that that is as relevant to inflation. So my point is, when the government spends money and the Fed monetizes the debt, it buys those treasuries with newly created bank reserves. Then you have an increase in the M2 money supply. Now, again, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're increasing the amount of dollars in aggregate total, because the dollars that are being created that are on the balance sheets of the commercial banking system, those could be going down faster than the government is spending. But again, I think that we have to compartmentalize where the dollars are, what balance sheets are the dollars affecting. And if the increase in dollars are affecting the balance sheets of the average Joe and Jane, then that's what really matters if we're trying to figure out the inflation, deflation, disinflation debate, right? So again, the government, so when you think about $5 trillion deficit for 2020, where a good majority of it's being monetized by the Fed, that would mean there are more dollars, not necessarily an aggregate total, but there are more dollars in the real economy, more dollars on the balance sheet of the average Joe and Jane that are out there chasing goods and services. Therefore, that would imply that, or put downward pressure on the dollar relative to domestic goods and services, or what we can buy domestically. So, and again, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's putting downward pressure on the dollar on the Dixie, because that's a measurement of the dollar pretty much against the euro. 57% of the DXY is the euro. But that's where the trade deficit comes into play. So we have, when you go to Target or you go to Walmart or Home Depot, you guys realize that 90% of what you see on the shelves is made outside of the United States. So we are an economy that it revolves around domestic services, right? It's your Uber, It's your Topgolf, it's your lawyers, it's accountants, it's restaurants, it's cafes, bars, the movie theater, whatever. That's a domestic service. So, but unfortunately, we can't live on domestic services. In order to live, we need goods, right? And we get the majority of our goods from outside the United States. So what do we send them? We send them dollars. So that means you've got all these green pieces of paper that are leaving the United States and circulating in the global economy. The bigger the trade deficit we run, in other words, the more we import and the more dollars we export, the more dollars are getting into the global monetary system and circulating. Well, if you have a lot more dollars that are circulating and fewer, let's say, euros, or when you have more dollars relative to euros because of this trade deficit, then that would put downward pressure on the dollar relative to the euro. The same thing for the yen, fill in the blank. So that's why, well, let me back up here. So when you look at how huge the twin deficits are for the United States right now, I mean, it's absolutely staggering. $5 trillion deficit, the trade deficit is at an all-time high or very close to it. And when you kind of think when you think about this, then you have to ask yourself, okay, well, how transitory, to use that word, are these twin deficits? And then you realize that these twin deficits are by no means transitory, that the government has to continue with the monetary heroin. It has to continue increasing the deficits, not decreasing them. It has to continue spending more money. The budget deficit has to expand. If the budget deficit expands, one of the ways that it will most likely expand is through continued UBI, or what effectively is UBI, but people getting paid to stay home. So if the if the budget deficit is expanding in this way, that means that by definition, we are as a society, we're creating fewer goods because no one's going to work. Well, if we're creating fewer goods, then we have to import more goods and export more dollars, which would mean the trade deficit, which most likely will increase, not decrease. So if you're someone that believes the probability is high that these twin deficits continue to increase, then that's why Gundlach has this long-term view of the dollar that it's completely doomed. I think that's really the main takeaway here, is that Gundlach sees these twin deficits increasing over time and there being no other way out. There is no other alternative, the Tina type of mentality. And that's why he sees the dollar really struggling. So I just wanted to go over the quick dynamics of how the twin deficits work. And, that's not all that's at play when you're talking about the dollar, but those two are large components of what makes the dollar go up or down, not only relative to goods and services, but relative to other fiat currencies. Okay, let's see. We've got Angelique in the house, Bull Dag, Cam White, Matthew Silva, Ann Cooper, Alan Zibelman, Tacticus, 1979, El Chomillo Pork Barrel Investing, All-Nighter Hider. All right, guys, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and I'll see you in the next video.